Okay, welcome to the Nick and Joe Show. It's a rootinest, tootinest, gunslingingest show this side of the Pecos. And if you don't get that reference, you didn't grow up with Looney Tunes. Not the way Joseph and I did. Do you remember what character said that?
Yosemite Sam.
You got it. That's right. Couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. He'd waste more ammunition shooting at bugs. And then they said he was too violent. Violent? What are you kidding? He can't. He could shoot his way out of a wet paper bag.
Well, it wasn't. It wasn't the violence. It was the gunplay.
Yeah, but so what? It's like
Tell me where you can find Ricochet Rabbit on television anymore. Anywhere.
Well, they have gotten rid of pretty much everything. Everything from Yosemite Sam to Speedy Gonzales, the fastest mouse in Mexico. That's gone. Mexico. That's right. And those cartoons are so much fun. It's just unbelievable how much fun they are to watch. I still say my favorite is Foghorn Leghorn in the episode where he gets all his feathers blown off and he walks across the screen holding his feathers and he looks at the camera as he walks by and he says, "I keep my feathers numbered for just such an occasion." And Mike, I laugh my tail off every time I see it, and my kids all look at me like, "What's so funny?" Okay, you just don't get the joke. Never mind. I'm not going to try to explain it.
Clearly,
obviously.
Oh well, what can you do, Nick? Do you know every time I see that countdown at the beginning of the show? Every time I see the countdown at the beginning of the show, I think of the television series 24.
24?
Yeah, you never saw with Kiefer Sutherland?
No.
Okay.
It's a new number.
You have to look it up. I don't know if it's on the internet well, I don't know if it's on YouTube, but do you get Netflix?
Yeah.
Check Netflix. Just put the number 24 with the digits not written out. Okay, it's a series. I don't know how many seasons it ran, but actually you'd probably like it, Nick.
Is there lots of gunplay, violence, and explosions?
Oh yeah, it's
all right, I like it already.
Yeah, it's there. Well, you know, it's,
I like it already.
Yeah.
Now
yeah.
I got to tell you,
but it's not. But it's funny, you know, because you know you can do that. I mean, you go to the movies, and some of the stuff, especially in American movies, action movies, like Americans are totally addicted to, you know, explosions, pyrotechnics, guns, the whole works. Okay. So you go to the movies, I don't know what percentage, but let's say 50% of all movies made nowadays are of that genre, right? No problem making those movies at all, putting them on the internet or anything like that.
Right.
But try to find Bugs Bunny.
Yeah, no kidding. You know, that's a great point. You can't find Bugs Bunny or Wile E. Coyote in the Roadrunner or Elmer Fudd, you know. Shh, I hunt no rabbits. And the rabbit's safer than if Elmer Fudd stayed home, he couldn't be safer. So anyway, because he couldn't hit the broadside of a barn either.
Well, he could, but he'd still miss the rabbit.
Okay, there you go.
There's the graphic for 24 right there. Okay, let me give you the 30-second rundown on what this is. Okay, every season is 24 episodes. And every episode represents 1 hour in a single day where Kiefer Sutherland is trying to save the world. Because he's some sort of a special anti-terrorist agent in the United States. And there's always some sort of a terrorist plot that he has to foil. And the whole season takes place over a 24-hour period. And each weekly episode represents one 1 hour period in that 24 hours. That's why they call it 24.
Okay, I understand that now. Right. There was a series called Red with oh, come on. The guy is a number 2 or 3 most wanted criminal on the FBI's most wanted list, and he turns himself in.
Right. Blacklist.
Blacklist, that's it. Blacklist with James Spader, I think his name is.
James Spader, that's right, yeah.
Brilliant actor. And I ate that up. I watched that. I just couldn't get enough of it. But you know what happens eventually? It gets to a point where you say, okay, these situations are getting so ridiculous that there simply is no way out. And yet he always pulled it off. The writers always found a way, and it got
my
old.
My wife and I watched it, and then like it just got it wasn't that it was too confusing. I mean the plots and subplots and subplots. Okay, I mean we just couldn't follow it anymore. So yeah, there's the graphic. Yeah. John's on the ball tonight.
I know the first. Yeah, I know that the first 8 or 9 seasons are brilliant, and him playing off the female heroine, the way that they go about that, develop that relationship, you figure out who she is finally. That was the main thing that kept you going. Who is this guy? Who is Red, right? And trying to figure all that out. That was I thoroughly enjoyed that, but after a while, it just got absurd. It was like Breaking Bad. It just got not Breaking Bad, Prison Break. It got to the point where these guys.
Yeah, I never saw Prison Break.
No matter what, because of them.
Well, no, I shouldn't say that. I saw a couple of episodes with my wife.
Yeah, well, and look, the idea was new and fresh at first, but sooner or later, it just gets dumb. So I just like plain old, good old fashioned, straight ahead kind of movies that aren't overly sophisticated, because I'm not all that sophisticated anyway. But on another note.
Yeah, Nick, before we go ahead. Before we go on, let me just tell everybody that, if you want to call in or text 613-413-2217 is our number. Is that what you were about to do, Nick? I'm sorry I cut you off like that.
Actually, no, but that's a very good time to do that.
Right. 613-413-2217. Go grab yourself a pad of paper and pen, and we'll give that number to you again in a minute.
Now, I got to tell you, I'm sitting in my 19-foot long camper trailer that I pull behind my pickup truck. We picked it up in Winnipeg. And
Nick has finally taken the plunge and set up a portable mobile studio.
Hey, listen, this is a test to see if we can do this, you and me on the road.
Take the show on the road.
Wouldn't that be fun? Take the show on the road. I mean, we might need a bigger trailer.
Yeah, well, we'll do, if we do this, Nick, and we take the show on the road, this is how we do it, okay? We have to find like a park or a parking lot or something like that, and then we do a tailgate party with the show.
I know where to do it. Go to Walmart.
Go to the local Walmart.
Yep.
Why not?
They allow overnight. Because they have these massive parking lots, and there's a whole subculture that revolves around parking at the Walmart parking lot that we've been introduced to. Yeah. When we were there in Winnipeg, we picked it up. It was too late in the day to head home. It's about a 5-hour drive from Winnipeg to Sioux Lookout. So we decided, let's try this. We had heard about it. Let's try it, see what it's like. So we parked the truck trailer, and there's about half a dozen of these camper trailers, and everybody, oh yeah, how you doing? What you doing? And they share experiences. My wife said, I got to go in and grab some stuff for supper because we hadn't had a chance to stock the trailer yet. So she goes in, she spends about $60-$70. And in the morning, she goes back in and spends another $60-$70 at Walmart. And I'm thinking, okay, that's why they don't mind this stuff, because people, when they're going to shop somewhere, it's right there. And
especially if it's a 24-hour Walmart.
Yeah. Oh, that's a whole different animal. Again, you don't want to go in after midnight. Then you become a Walmartian. That's really bad. Anyway, so we bring it home, and it's been a real adventure, because it's like you got to learn all kinds of. I had the fridge working. Now it's not. I don't know why yet, but I'll get it figured out. There's a whole. It's mobile. It really is a mobile home. You're dragging your house behind you. And the other thing I found out is it cuts my gas mileage in half. Like I was getting 22, 24 with the truck. I'm down around 12 now pulling this thing around. The upside is I can stop wherever I want to. I don't have to worry about motels. If we have the fridge stocked and we have the cupboard stocked and all that, I don't have to worry about buying meals. So there's a trade-off. And you can park pretty much, within reason, pretty much anywhere. And if you find an RV place with 30 amp power, you can run. You've got your air conditioner going, or you have a little gen set with you. You have your air conditioning going in the summertime, the microwave and all that stuff. You're really quite comfortable.
Okay,
So,
let me just give people. I promise we give that number again to our listeners.
right ahead.
So it's 613-413-2217. So you can call in, be on the show live by phone, or you can send us a text. So again, 613-413-2217. Okay, Nick, come on. Let's get going here, Nick.
Let's get down to the meat.
Let's get down to business here, Nick, because I know people want to know what's going on in our personal day-to-day lives, Nick, but I just don't know. Maybe that's just, I don't know. I'm not sure that people.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to start here.
Okay.
I'm looking for some answers, and I posed this to you before the show. This comes to us from the Sun news chain out of England. So this is the Ottawa. This is not the Ottawa Citizen or the Ottawa Sun or the Calgary Sun or that chain. This is a British version of that. Okay, and according to them, all right, I'm going to read off some numbers from England, and then I'm going to read off some numbers from Russia. And I have a question I want to answer. I want answered by our listeners, or Joseph, you want to take a shot at it, be my guest.
Okay, so the first series of numbers come from Britain, and the second series of numbers are going to come from Russia. Okay, just wanted to clarify that.
They're expressed in percentages, okay? So the price of food overall is up 10.5%. This is starting in the United Kingdom. Potatoes are up by 18%, bananas by 12%, cabbage by 10%, tomatoes by 15%, carrots by 16%, and energy is 80%, 80%. So if it cost you $1 a year ago, it costs you $1.80 now, if I understand percentages right. Now, in Russia, the price of food generally is down 11.3%. Potatoes are down 28%, bananas 14%, cabbage 33%, tomatoes 14%, carrots 13%. These are all down now. The only thing that went up was energy by 10%. Now, the question I have is, how is that possible?
Well,
I thought we were supposed to be punishing Russia.
To start off with, I don't trust the numbers, okay? I don't know how the Sun chain sourced their information. So I'm skeptical to start with, okay? But having, they went to the embassy and got the numbers from an embassy counselor or something like that. I don't know.
But if you're a British paper, why would you print this stuff?
Well, not every UK newspaper is really credible, and I'm not necessarily making a comment on the Sun chain because I don't know. I just want to emphasize that. I'm not saying that they're not credible. I'm just saying that I'm a little skeptical about those numbers, Nick. But I will say this, okay? My guess is that because they're having difficulty, I assume that they're having difficulty importing food, then one has to wonder whether or not this is a reflection of the fact that people are being forced to buy food that's produced domestically, which is going to be cheaper to start with. And why would people be so the price is down? And one of the reasons the price is down is because people generally, when the food from other countries is available, they'll probably, if they can afford it, they'll end up buying that food because the quality of the stuff that's produced in Russia maybe isn't that good. So, I mean, I'm just speculating here. You're asking, how is this possible? I mean, that's a possibility, I suppose.
It is. On the other hand, Russia does have fertile areas that it can and does turn into agriculture. And Ukraine was a big part of that. But
not. They've always traditionally, interestingly enough, Russia has been a net food importer. So, notwithstanding the fact that they have a whole lot of arable land, I don't know how much of it's cultivated, especially with the fact that the Ukraine, which was the big breadbasket of the former Soviet Union, not being part of that equation anymore. So that probably makes a difference. But my impression is that the Russians, even with Ukraine being part of the equation, still would have to import grain and stuff from overseas. So for whatever reason, they just haven't gotten their act together in so many different ways. But I think the main point, the main takeaway here, Nick, is that irrespective of how inflation is hitting them as opposed to the UK or any other place in the world, is the fact that they actually have this produce available, and they actually have energy, and so one wonders whether or not, or how effective sanctions are against working in terms of punishing them, the Russians, that is, for having invaded and committed aggression against Ukraine. And I think that's a very good question. My sense is that they aren't suffering that much. And remember, we're talking Russia here. Now, the Russians are not exactly, the big cities are world class. But once you get out of the big cities, okay, a lot of Russia is very comparable to the third world. And so, when you talk about making the Russian people suffer, I'm not entirely sure how much suffering the Russian people are actually experiencing as a result of whatever the impact of these sanctions are. I'm sure that there are, oligarchs that are feeling the pinch in one way or another. But this is the other thing to remember. Let's face facts, okay? When you have a couple of $1 billion in the bank to spend on whatever you want to spend it on, chances are, sanctions notwithstanding, you're probably going to find the stuff also. So it's a very dichotomous society in Russia. You have the majority of Russians who continue to be fairly poor, relatively poor, and then you have the super rich. And okay, in the big cities, it's not as bad as that. But once you get out of the cities, okay, it's there isn't a whole lot of middle class in Russia outside of the cities, and there are a lot of people that still live outside of the big cities and small cities, towns, and villages in Russia.
That all of that is very true. When I saw those numbers, I thought cannot be possible, because one of the great weapons we had against the old Soviet Union was our ability to produce far more than we needed. We simply outproduced them, and that's what brought down, in a nutshell, is what brought down the former, Soviet Union.
To a degree, you're right. Yes, that was a factor for sure.
So now, when I saw those numbers, I thought, wait, this simply can't be. It's certainly not, and I'm as skeptical of the numbers as you are, because it's just a graphic from the Sun. There's no, say, according to these studies or, by this research. It's just a graphic they posted on a page in a newspaper, and somebody copied it and posted it. So I'm not saying they're lying. I'm just, because we all know how honest the news media is in the Western world these days, or across the world generally. But it does leave a big question mark. So when I saw it, I thought that this cannot be what it appears to be. It simply doesn't make sense.
Look, Nick, again, I think the takeaway from this is, irrespective of how accurate these numbers are or inaccurate, I think the takeaway is that the sanctions that we've imposed on the Russians in response to their invasion of the Ukraine are of limited effect, and the sanctions of that nature would be, I think, devastating if we were talking about them being imposed on us here in Canada or anywhere else in the Western world or in the first world. But that's because we're used to luxuries that have become just basic standard of living expectations here in the West that many Russians haven't experienced, let alone gotten used to. So the pain of privation cuts far deeper here in the first world, in the Western world, than it does in Russia. And so this has always been, I think, not an argument against sanctions, but an argument against the assumption that sanctions alone are going to significantly impact the behavior of that country. And there's another lesson to be learned here, because we're talking about Russia alone. but I think that you can apply largely the same logic when it comes to countries like China. If God forbid the Chinese were, let's say, to invade Taiwan, and we don't want to get into a shooting war with communist China over an invasion of Taiwan, for instance, well, we might be tempted to rely on sanctions. Sanctions aren't going to bring down the communist government in China. And my guess is that it's not going to have that great an impact on the day-to-day lives of the general population. Will it hurt some people who have become super rich in China as a result of some of their economic reforms? Okay, yeah, but again, the question is, does the government care? And I'm not convinced that the government cares. So, we tend to make the mistake, Nick, of always making the assumption that the rest of the world cares about things that we care about in the West to the same degree that we care about them. And when I say things, I'm really referring to material things.
Yeah, look, again, there's not many holes in that logic. But when I sit here and I look at those numbers, I think, okay, obviously there's something wrong. But speaking of just switching just a little bit, shuffling over a little bit from one topic to another, because I think what we both agree on is those numbers are inexplicable and hard to understand. But according to Justin Trudeau, he has now announced a new team dedicated countering Russian disinformation. This is a great segue into this piece, by the way. I don't know if I sent this to you or not, but it's
I did. Yes, you did.
Okay. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Tuesday announced that a number of measures aimed against Russia. There's a problem here; it's in my way. I'm having trouble reading it. Including the creation of a team dedicated to tackling Russian state-sponsored misinformation. Where have we heard all this before? The announcement was made during the second annual summit for the heads of state and government of the International Crimea Platform, which was held virtually. One more paragraph, and then we'll get into it. Let's see if I can get rid of those. According to a statement released by the government, Canada will continue to counter Russian state-sponsored disinformation by creating a dedicated team to help increase Canada's capacity to understand, monitor, and detect Russian and other state-sponsored disinformation enable deeper international collaboration, including through the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism, or RR.
I'm sorry. I'm laughing because, right. Our rapid response.
Yeah.
Our rapid response team. Let's get at those Facebook ads. Look, I actually, I'm actually sympathetic. I know that this kind of thing is going on. I know, and we all know this, that there's a lot of disinformation out there. We all know that one of the major sources of disinformation, in order to sow discord, confusion, etc., are the Russians for strategic reasons. My guess is probably the Chinese do the same thing, and maybe some other countries. But I think that predominantly the problem right now is Russia, and so I get it. I understand that there's a problem here, and the people are struggling to find the solution. My concern here is that in our rush to figure out what to do about this, that I don't entirely trust our government, this government in particular, to limit its attention simply to what it believes to be Russian disinformation. And there's there've been a lot of instances where the government has itself gotten things very wrong and promulgated, whether purposely or not, severe disinformation about a lot of different things. So it's a really slippery slope, and I don't know how you police such a an organization or a team or a rapid response team. You know, they make it sound like, okay, we've got to react to this terrorist attack. Hostages have been taken.
Right.
Well, hostages. Maybe they're holding your mind hostage. I don't know. Of course, no. I was going to make a joke about holding certain people's minds hostage.
I know what you were going to say.
But I think I'll refrain. I'm going to restrain myself, Nick.
Okay. I disagree with you a little bit. Yes, Russia is a threat. But I think from a Canadian perspective, and for a large chunk of the rest of the world, they're not the threat. That belongs to the Chinese Communist Party. With the moves they've been making on the international stage, everything from the whole Huawei thing to the Silk Road to buying up resources and the ability to export them from countries because they own the ports and so on, all that stuff, they're really bucking hard at trying to surpass the United States as the dominant world power. They are, in my mind, a far greater threat. So Justin comes out and says, we're going to go after Russian disinformation. Wait a minute. I think you've got a much bigger problem over here with the Chinese than you do with the Russians. I'm not trying to paint the Russians as heroes. Don't get me wrong. But I'm saying that if you have to look at the two threats, in my mind, the one that is the bigger threat has to be first is China. You're not going to bring them to heel, but you have to recognize they're doing everything from building nuclear powered icebreakers to go into the north. Their attitude is we have 1/3 of the world's population, therefore we get 1/3 of the resources. That's their mentality. Never mind sovereignty. Never mind, hey, you can't go in that backyard. It's not yours. None of that applies to them from their perspective. Then you've got the threat they pose to Taiwan and the whole southern Asia Minor continent. Okay, that whole neck of the woods down there is under threat by these guys. Russia, not so much. Now, there's a problem in Ukraine, and we could talk about that all night.
Sure.
But from that perspective, I think that he's really, this is where I think you see the little strings that move that marionette, pulling him just a little bit off to the side, say, talk about those guys, not us, because we're your friends. And remember, who butters your bread? And that's the kind of manipulation we don't need. You know, we need to be able to stand on our own 2 feet and identify threats for what they are, not for what they tell us they are.
Right. Well, look, Nick, I'm not quite as cynical as you are on some of this stuff, at least not on the level or with respect to
cynical
the specific.
Older I get.
No, it's okay. But I am cynical in one area, and that is I can't help but wonder, you know, how much of this is just the government reacting to its own rhetoric and the fears that it itself has fomented. You know, it's like, do the Russians place ads in Facebook? Okay, well, I suppose they do. Does it influence elections? I don't know, but you know, there's all of the talk for years now in the United States about, you know, Russian interference in elections and stuff like that. And you repeat it over and over again, and before you know it, it becomes a real thing in your mind, and you have to react to it. Is it real? Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. How real is it? Is it? How much of an impact do these types of ads and misinformation have? I don't know. But I suspect that a lot of this sort of goes back to, not that I want to open up this can of worms, okay, but I suspect a lot of this goes to the frustration that the government had that it couldn't control the messaging on COVID and COVID vaccinations, etc., for better or for worse. And so, you know, they have this idea that we have to find ways to control disinformation. And now they're talking about targeting Russian disinformation. And again, I'm not saying that it's not a problem, but what I'm saying is, you know, I think in something like this, we have to be really careful that the cure doesn't kill the patient. And this is my great concern about this kind of talk when I hear it from the government. Is I'm really concerned about how a unit like this is to be policed, and how you can ensure that it doesn't undermine the freedoms of Canadians, including, I think, the important right to be wrong. That's when you live in a society where you have free speech, you have a fundamental right to be wrong.
I totally agree with you. Now, I think one of the problems too that adds to this is the fact that we don't teach within our schools the successive generations about the evils of communism. And people don't understand what a threat it really is. And, so when he comes out and says Russian disinformation, well, it should be communist disinformation, regardless of what country it comes from, because there's more than just Russia. And there were those who would argue that Russia's not even a communist country. Not really, not anymore. But China certainly is. North Korea certainly is. There's all kinds of different Vietnam. There's all kinds of different communist states out there that pose, a counter to the Western model of what it takes to be a successful country. And if we were to teach that within our schools and show people in a clear, this is going to be mighty hard to do because of the bent of many of the teachers and the people in Teachers College. You have a situation where people are growing up going, so that's just another way of doing things. No, it's not. It's the worst way to do things. It's not just another way. It's the worst way. And we have to avoid it. And here's why. And nobody explains that anymore. So when somebody like me goes off like a rocket, seeing this stuff, everybody else around him who's younger than you and I are goes, what's your problem, dude? Lighten up. It's just Russia. We know what they're all about. What they're doing in Crimea. I said, well, you know what? There's more to it than that. And here's why we cannot embrace anything to do with communism in Canada. And yet socialism's on the rise, which is the blood brother to communism. Communist mentality has been seeping into our school system for years. And here we sit. Now we've got a prime minister who doesn't know his backside from a hole in the ground, talking about putting together a panel of people who've been trained in that education system to dispel Russian disinformation. Good luck. I'm a little skeptical.
Well, and I think you have the right to be skeptical.
I think,
Nick, I think that the most important thing we can do right now is go for a break.
Oh, yeah. Probably a good idea. All right. We'll take a break. We'll be back with more on the Nick and Joe Show right after this. Stick around.
Who says you can't turn the clock back? Experience the excitement of open-air flying and see Canada's national capital region like you've never seen it before from the open cockpit of a vintage 1930s biplane. Are you up for the adventure? Put on your helmet and goggles and strap yourself in. Book your flight today. Go to OttawaBiplaneAdventures.com. That's OttawaBiplaneAdventures.com. Ottawa Biplane Adventures. The adventure begins here.
Oh my gosh, that was so exciting! I gotta do it again.
All right, welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show, folks. I'm Nick, he's Joe, he's in Ottawa, and I'm not all that far away tonight. I'm out here in Killaloo, sitting in my trailer, ready. My son's getting married this Saturday, so we decided to trundle on down, make the trip. He kind of likes to have mom and dad there when he gets hitched, as if that's an everyday occurrence. No, actually, Peter's... he's a very intelligent young man. I'm really proud of him. And his whole life is run by a spreadsheet. 5 years ago, I couldn't even spell spreadsheet. And that's all he uses when he makes a decision about what to buy or what move to make. It's all on a spreadsheet. So Peter, he loves his spreadsheets. Although I doubt
marriage might just cure him of that.
Yeah, well, you know what? His wife to be, Andrea, is a real sweetheart. We just love her to death. And I think she's going to give him the feminine touch that he needs. Kind of like whack right upside the head.
Yes.
So they are
that gentle feminine touch.
yeah, it sounds a lot like a pistol shot when it comes across the side of your head. Anyway, but she'll keep him in line. So we're really fortunate to have her join the family, and I can't be happier for Peter. And it'll be quite the party, I'll tell you that much. That's for sure. All right, that aside, Joseph, speaking of communism, I think you and I should do a show one night about the evils of communism, just to try to help people understand why, where it comes from, what it means, the kind of death toll that follows it, the evils that it brings, so that people can begin to understand that this is not something we want to embrace. As a matter of fact, this is something we want to run away from as just as fast as our 3 feet can carry us.
Right.
Because, man, I'm telling you, this is not something we want to get anywhere near. So
yeah, and it's the whole socialist mentality, Nick. And I know when we talk about this kind of thing, people out there, some people, they roll their eyes and they go, oh, you guys are just conspiracy theorists, etc. But it's the whole mentality that somebody knows better than you do how to live your life, etc. And
right.
and it's my mission, and I'm not speaking about me particularly, but I'm just speaking figuratively here. My mission in life is to save you from yourself, and so that's actually probably the most important thing to understand about this whole mentality, and that is that it's predicated on a very real, altruistic almost emotion. We have to save the world. Don't you understand? My goodness gracious, we have to save you from you. We have to save this. We have to save that. Don't you know that that when you do this, it's better for you? It goes on and on and on. And in reality, some of the decisions or some of the positions that they take, and I'm speaking here very high level, very upper level theoretical here. Okay, we're not getting into examples or anything like that, but I mean we have from time to time without necessarily calling it a socialist mentality, but it's all about this is what makes it. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here, but this is what makes it so hard to beat sometimes. Is that it really is about doing good, and without understanding that sometimes the greatest evil that you can commit against another person is actually done for the best of intentions. But it takes a certain amount, I think, of age and experience and wisdom and perspective to finally start to appreciate that. And unfortunately, I know a whole lot of people that are older and ought to know better that still think that way. So as I said before, it just I'm going to say this because sorry, Nick, to keep going here, but I really want to reiterate this, okay? Because it's really important, okay? In a free society, you have the fundamental right to be wrong. And if you don't have the right to be wrong, you're going to have thought police all the time over you, making sure that you're thinking right. And that's a very dangerous situation because being human beings, we're all fallible and we all make mistakes and we're all wrong from time to time. But what happens when the thought police are wrong, but they think they're right? This is the thing is, you have to stop trying to control how people think and how they behave, within certain limits, obviously. That's not an absolute approach, but that's a general approach. But that's what makes it so hard to combat these things.
Look, I understand that. But at the same time, if we don't step up and start pointing out the sins and the horror of communism, and I mean that literally. It is a horrific method of government. And if there's modern example, you don't need to go back to the 1920s, 30s, or World War II or anything.
No.
Just look what the Uyghurs are going through China, under a communist government.
Sure.
Look at the body count in the 20th century for socialist / communist style dictatorships and regimes. 100 million people paid with their lives for this, and we want to embrace it. I'm sorry, there's a problem here. So at some point, we have to stand up and start pointing out to people, and by we, I'm using the royal sense here, not just you and I, but people have to stand up and start saying, okay, look, this is communistic in its mindset. This is like the idea of let's take something out of Canadian politics right now, which would be, let's say, the basic income. Tell me how that isn't a communistic point of view, because the communists, they would give everybody the same wage. If you had a particular job, you all get paid the same, no matter how hard you worked or you didn't work. Well, and they all get paid whatever it was. So there's no incentive to be creative.
Yeah, well, and of course that of course is a genuine, valid concern. The problem with the basic income proposals, guaranteed basic income, or guaranteed minimum income, or whatever you want to call it, is that okay? That, and this is something that I think conservatives have to understand, is that we actually already have it. We have it in a hodgepodge of different programs, different welfare programs, social housing, subsidies, blah, 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 blah. And so, there is an argument to be made. And again, I'm not here making the case for guaranteed minimum income, don't get me wrong, but I am saying that there is a case to be made for consolidating all of these different programs under one simple program and just saying to people, okay, look, if you fall below a certain income, that we have a safety net, and that's what the safety net is. It's guaranteed minimum income, and what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of all of the other programs. And of course, this of course is never going to happen, because that's the problem with the bureaucracy, is that once you have a program, unless when you first created it, from a legislative point of view, that you had some sort of a sunset clause in the enabling legislation that created the bureaucracy, it just goes on and on and on. So you get these multiple levels and layers of bureaucracy, sometimes competing ones against one another. And that's go ahead.
I was just going to say, my son has, I don't know whether he coined it, but he's the first person I heard it from. And he came out and he said to me, Dad, the bureaucracy is expanding to support the ever expanding bureaucracy. And that's in a nutshell what you just said. It's like Ronald Reagan would say that the only two things in life that never die are taxes and government programs. And he's quite right.
To a large degree, he's right.
Yeah, I can't remember the last time the government said, well, we don't need that program anymore. And there is some merit. Like, I don't want people starving in the streets or dying for lack of medication. But I don't think you need to have this is not something, because before socialism came along, before we had these government-run social safety nets, we already had many of these institutions in place to deal with this. It wasn't because all of a sudden the government said, you guys are a bunch of slugs, man. How could you let that woman die on the street because she had no place to go? Or how could you let that guy drink himself to death? Or, whatever the malady was.
Well, this is it. It's that the government has taken charity has always existed. And so, we've always had charitable institutions. We've always had organizations that are involved in doing charitable work, outreach work, helping the disadvantaged, helping the people who are impoverished, if you will, and that is part of what we are in Western society. That is part of our identity, and the fact that we have government doing a lot of these things in the first place, when we started to use the government to do a lot of these things, it was for that very reason. Was that we wanted the government to reflect what is our important values within our society, and we assumed that the government could, and it can, theoretically do a lot of these things more efficiently than the private sector can. But I think that what we underestimated, and I don't mean you and I, Nick, because a lot of these decisions were made, before we were even born. But what we underestimated was two things. We underestimated how ultimately, in the long run, inefficient government delivery of these kinds of charitable services can be, because, as your son pointed out, the bureaucracy grows and it grows and it grows, and to the point where, you every time you want to touch the bureaucracy, everybody screams and says, well, you're going to take away, poor people's programming. And of course, that's never the intention. But that's the second problem. The second problem is that government, and we didn't necessarily intend this, and again, I'm not speaking about you and I'm speaking the royal we, but the intent was never to crowd out private charity, but that's essentially what has happened. And so if we're going to get rid of some of these programs, then the churches and private institutions and private donors are going to have to step up, and they're going to have to retake their proper place in their individual communities. And I will say this, and I'm not defending government programming. I think that there's a lot of problems with government programming, but what I will say is this: I'm skeptical about whether or not society has the right mindset to engage itself as individuals and as private individuals in charitable endeavors.
I think
to a certain extent, just to finish the thought, Nick, to a certain degree, I think that what we've done is we've lost, and again, not you and me necessarily, but generally speaking, society has lost its sense of charity, largely because it has had for so long now the state filling that role, and I don't know how you recapture it, but I'm skeptical about the ability and even the will, if I may say so, about institutions like the church writ large to encourage its members and engage its members and engage itself in again reestablishing its role as an important charity provider in the community.
Okay, well, let me respond to that in a couple of ways. First of all, sure. Murray makes a good point. He says back in the days before high taxes, people used to look after themselves, or after each other, I should say. And he's quite right. In those days, that's exactly what happened. And nobody, because people are, if you live in a community and you see a community member suffering, the tendency is to want to relieve that suffering and reach out and do whatever you can to help them get back on their feet.
Right.
So, okay, that is historically accurate. Today, not so much for some of the reasons you articulated. But I think there's another element. There's two elements. Allison and I are considering joining the Rotary. I think it's the Rotary Club up in Sioux Lookout, and they're great people. We went out for a barbecue with them and got some time to spend some time around them, but there's a problem. The youngest person there was 35 or 40. Right. There are no youth, and there's a couple of reasons for that. For one thing, it's not taught that charity, to be part of a charitable organization in our schools. They're so wrapped up with, getting ahead and getting onto university and studies and all. Nobody ever mentions the fact that the value of contributing to a service club is worth it to help build your community. Okay, so that's one element. We don't have, and the other element, and I just thought of a third one, is the fact that we don't have the bodies. There's just not enough people to go out there and step up and say, okay, we need to revitalize these service clubs, the Lions, the Rotary, the Knights of Columbus, you name it, whatever it is. Okay. And refill their ranks with people who are service minded, because they just don't exist. Those people aren't there. And the third reason is because the government, and I'm speaking in a general sense, I'm not just picking on Trudeau, but he is the worst at this, has been busy dividing and conquering. He's not building a sense of family where we rally around a standard that all of us can claim, say these are our values, this is where we draw our line in the sand, this is our land, this is our backyard, this is where we come together as a group, and we will help each other, defend each other, and be there for each other. That's been run right into the ground with a lot of the revisionist history, with a lot of the divisiveness within the different communities. You've got this whole idea that Canada's a racist country, when none of that's true. Certainly not. I mean, there's racists in every country, but to say that Canada is systemically racist is an absolutely outrageous thing to say. But nobody ever refutes it. So you have this tearing at the fabric. And I think that what is propelling a lot of this stuff, and why it would take a tremendous effort to turn that all around. I'm not saying it's impossible. Nothing's impossible. But boy, is it going to take a lot of work. And we're going to have to start either having more of our own children to raise our birth rate to the point where we can sustain our population with, I'm not knocking immigration, but without immigration, we should be able to at least sustain our population and then bring in those who would benefit the country. That's what immigration is supposed to be about. Okay, I'm not talking about refugees or any of that stuff, but I'm talking about just plain old, everyday, ordinary. I want to live in I want to become part of your community. Okay, what do you bring to the table? Kind of mentality around immigration. So those are some of the reasons why to take back. I hate to say this, but to take back the streets. I hate the sound of that. To take back our country. Because even that has been given a negative moniker now. It's going to take a tremendous amount of effort, will, and participation by those of us who still care for this place.
Well, Nick, I'm going to be very controversial now. Okay. And you know me, I generally don't I'm generally not shy about being controversial, but let me just say this, Nick. Okay. I think that what you're saying is largely true. But I think that where it actually starts, it's not taking back the country, and it's not taking back our
culture,
whatever streets. Sorry, not taking back the streets, not taking back the culture, or not taking back the country. Taking back the culture sounds like a big project, but how you do that is you do it basically by taking back your own family. I think it starts in your family. I think you have to have your children. You have to raise your children the way that you think is important. I think you have to instill in them the right values and sense of not just a sense of independence, because I think that's important, but also at the same time to balance that with a sense of appropriate interdependence, where they understand that they are themselves, but they're also part of a broader community, and that they have responsibilities to their fellow human being, but that those are personal responsibilities that they have an obligation to discharge themselves, not to rely on the state to say, well, yes, which is kind of the mindset we find ourselves having nowadays in our society, is to say, yes, of course we have individual responsibilities to the community, the broader community. That's why I pay taxes. Okay. And so all of a sudden, so the state becomes the agent for my discharging my responsibilities to the community. And what we have to do is we have to teach our children that that's not the case, that irrespective of what the state does or doesn't do, the responsibility is ours, and it's a personal responsibility. And if the state isn't discharging the responsibilities adequately on our behalf, that doesn't mean that we have a problem with the state. That it may be a set of problems beside the fact that we still have that personal obligation. And that's where we've kind of lost it, which brings me to the second response I have, part B, to what you had to say, Nick, and that is, not only do we have to take back our own families and build that sort of fence, if you will, around them to protect them from the crazy lunatic ideas that are floating out there, and to prepare them to refute them when the time comes, but we actually have to take back our churches. And again, I'm speaking, obviously, I don't go to church, I go to a synagogue, but I'm speaking about churches in a broad sense.
In the royal sense,
yeah. Because my sense is that it begins when it comes to community engagement, collective pooling resources in order to engage with our local communities on a charitable level. That that has always been historically a function that the church performed, that our religious institutions performed, and that we were engaged with our community largely through those institutions. And I'm not convinced that church leaders these days have the same kind of sense of responsibility and being sort of the conduit of personal charity into the community. And even more importantly, I'm not convinced that church leaders today are prepared to put their foot down and to say, use their position as leaders in the community to say this is right and this is wrong. In other words, the churches themselves have become polluted with this unrestricted, unrestrained relativism, and they're afraid. Church leaders seem to be either afraid to speak out, or they're supportive of ideas and philosophies that are antithetical to the fundamental teachings of the church. And I'm not getting into a theological discussion here, although I think a lot of it comes from, emanates from theology. But that's it. Is it's if the church again writ large is not going to step up, then I don't know what communal institutions there are out there.
Yeah.
And because our sense of propriety, our sense of morality has to originate somewhere. Okay. And I know maybe people are going to be listening and watching the show, but they may disagree with me, but it's hard for me to understand how if you're not engaged on some level with religion, okay, and I know how difficult this is, and I know how controversial what I'm saying here may sound, but if you're not engaged with the idea of some sort of an objective morality in the universe, and some sort of an objective source of that morality, whether you want to call it God or you want to call it natural law, okay, if you simply reject that notion, then how do you even make the case for the government to be involved in charitable work?
Well, I think a lot of these people who are in leadership positions, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I don't want to get into a lot of church politics. There's plenty in the Catholic.
I don't want to get into any church politics.
I know, but I've seen more than one leader shot to pieces by his own congregation for a whole host of reasons, who are very good men, stand up for what's right, and are not afraid to say so from the pulpit. The problem is that this infection of this, this isn't my problem, or this socialist mentality that's, it's why I pay my taxes, all that stuff. That's where you see it come back to bite those who still recognize the truth, if I can use that phrase, and stand up for themselves. I could relate half a dozen stories about that. I'm not going to, and for the sake of the show. It's just your point is well made, that not only do we individually, and I like your point about taking back our families. I know a lot of people don't like Fox, but I've been enjoying the Greg Gutfeld show, and he's a co-host called Tyrus. Now, Tyrus is a mountain of a man. He's 6'5" and weighs about well over 300 pounds, and it's all solid muscle. This guy is a world wrestling champion, but he's one of the brightest men I think I've encountered. And he basically said the same thing when they were talking about, on one of Gutfeld's shows, we're talking about the scores for reading and math and how they've been dropping like a rock because of COVID and because of Zoom learning and all this stuff. And he said, guys, I'm going to be the bad guy, but it's, in a nutshell, he said, it's bad parenting. parents are dropping the ball. They're not teaching their kids. They're not taking responsibility for them. And I'm compressing, 5 minutes worth of monologue down into a couple of seconds. If you want to see it, just go to Greg Gutfeld's show, look for Tyrus, and you'll find the episode. But I think he was exactly right. But overall, for us as a nation to stand up and start taking things back, it requires everything you talked about and then some. And with that, we have to take a break. We'll be back with more on the Nick and Joe Show right after this.
We all know that climate change is real. But with countries like China and India failing to do their part, what Canadians need now more than ever is a Made in Canada climate change plan. A real plan that responds to the real-world needs of Canadians. A balanced plan that supports responsible economic growth and strengthens our essential infrastructure. A responsible plan that protects our natural environment and ensures that all Canadians enjoy the blessings of clean air, clean land, and clean water for generations to come. It's time for Canadian politicians to show real leadership in the world, putting partisanship and ideology aside. It's time for a sensible climate plan. We're the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and we're ready to help. To learn more, visit our website, icsc-canada.com.
Okay, welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show, folks. Boy, that break was just exactly long enough. All right. Well, in the first hour, by the way, put the number up, John, again, please, if you don't mind. I'm trying to develop that habit of putting that number 613-413-2217. You can either text or call at that number, and you can also join us via video chat at blasterradio.com. There, I got that housekeeping done right off the bat. I'm so proud of myself because basically
you're the man, Nick.
Believe me, it doesn't happen very often. There it is again, 613-413-2217. One of these days I'll have it memorized and I won't even have to look at the screen. Isn't that impressive?
You are an impressive person, Nick.
All right. So that.
And I know I sounded sarcastic there, but I didn't intend to be sarcastic.
Well, it's okay. I'm used to sarcasm. It's true when people start talking like that.
Well, that's because you're married, Nick.
All right.
Married men are all used to sarcasm.
True enough. Okay. Now, one of the things that is plaguing Canada, there are a bunch of things. But what's going on here is we have the Liberal government has decided they're going to be out in Vancouver to figure out what to do about the economy. Okay, now, look, let me share just a couple of paragraphs to give you a sense of the story. This is from CBC, and I believe it's dated today. And if it's not, it's awfully close. All right. The Liberal cabinet began 3 days of meetings in Vancouver today to hash out the government's fall playbook with the rising cost of living and the state of the economy topping the agenda as Parliament prepares to return of MPs. Our focus this week, as we kick off what will be a busy and important fall of parliamentary work, is on the economy, is hearing from Canadians, is working with Canadians to solve the very real pressure they're facing, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Tuesday in an event in Squamish, BC. All right, that's enough. First of all, he's had over 2 years to listen to what we have to say, and he's ignored us at every turn. So why should we believe him now?
7 years, Nick.
Oh God, has it been that long? Yeah, that's right. That's right. He got elected in 2015, first time.
That's it. Yeah, 7 years.
Anyway, so the point is, he's had plenty of time to put his ear to the ground and figure out what people are saying and to pay attention to them. And over and over and over again, he's come out with priorities not shared by the Canadian population. Yeah, not even close.
And go figure, he keeps getting reelected. What does that say to you?
Look, the mystery to me about that, how that happens, I can't figure it out. I just can't get my head around that. How could you possibly reelect somebody who lies to you as often as this guy does? Okay, who has scandal after scandal after scandal and is demonstrably the worst prime minister we've ever had. Anyway, not that I have an opinion on the matter.
As I always say, Nick, okay, don't sugarcoat it. Give it to us straight.
Well, believe me, there's no sugar on this coating.
No.
Anyway, the point I'm making is that they figure they can sort this out in 3 days. You know what, yeah. Joseph, you and I could have done this in 10 minutes. What do you think that the number one way? What's that?
I said, pardon my yawn.
Yeah, I know it's kind of a dull topic, but I get
no. It's
anyway. But if I was the person waving the magic wand, the very first thing I would do is repeal completely the carbon tax. That number one, stop making energy any more expensive than it absolutely has to be.
Right.
That's number one. Number two, get out of the way of business. Number three, scrap any mandate that inhibits that, including all the old COVID. Now they're pretty much gone now, but look at the damage it did to the country from a business perspective. It's where the taxes come from. It's where jobs come from. It's where a whole host of things. The business, the entrepreneurial center of the country, is the heart of the country from an economic point of view, and he's done nothing but strangle that. So why? I'm trying to be polite, and I'm trying not to use language.
As we used to say to your friend Lowell, right? Nick, take a Valium, massage your temples.
I don't think that's working, but anyway,
we need John. We need some quiet yoga music in the background for when Nick gets this way.
Oh my God, please spare me if I have to listen to Enya one more time. Anyway, but the point I'm making is they've had years to sort this out. They're not going to fix it in 3 days.
Well, they're not going to fix it at all. This is the fallacy. And this isn't a liberal versus conservative thing. It's not a Justin Trudeau thing, okay? It's the fallacy out there is that the government creates jobs. Government does not create jobs except for when you hire public servants, okay? And government doesn't create wealth. It consumes wealth, including when you hire public servants, because public servants are paid from the profit that's created. I mean, that if you want to talk about it, if you want to boil it down to its most fundamental level, Nick, the wealth that you create in a country is the profit that you make, that the private sector makes on its business. Okay, I suppose you can also say that you're creating some sort of monetary value in something if you're working. And you take, for instance, a tree, and everybody that's involved in from the harvesting of that tree, the planting, the harvesting, the cutting it up into lumber, the using the lumber to build houses or other structures, okay, are all involved in adding a percentage or a portion of wealth to that piece of raw material, okay. But when it comes to government, and this is not a knock against government, it's just the nature of the beast, and that is that government consumes wealth, and so this whole thing, it's just a fallacy. This idea of we're going to create jobs. Well, no, you're not going to create any jobs. Okay, you'll create conditions where jobs might be created in the private sector, or you'll create conditions where jobs are not going to be created in the private sector and they might be lost. But your role is secondary to the actual act of creating the jobs. And that's just a fundamental truth that for whatever reason, people in government, whether irrespective of what political party they belong to, just don't seem to understand that.
Well, a classic example of what happens when governments run amok trying to control economies and trying to control the population is the state of California right now. I'm trying to remember when it starts. I know by 2035 they want to ban all internal combustion engines. What?
It sounds a little bit like Ottawa.
No, I'm reading what John just posted. Saskatchewan murder suspect Miles Sanderson is dead following arrest. RCP source tells me he died in the ambulance, so there must have been some kind of altercation or shootout. I think that's the second one of that horrific stabbing out in Saskatchewan that was in the news this week. Right. I wasn't going to mention it tonight because there's, it's a tragedy, but what can we do about it? Unless
it's not a tragedy, Nick. It's a crime.
Crime. Okay, you're right. Yes.
Sorry.
But the point I'm making is that unless they're going to bring out a knife registry, which really works well in England where they have one, what more is there to say about it?
Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day. I was going to go, where's our friend? What was his name? Was it Siddiqui or Livingston? I think it was Siddiqui. That was the mayor in London that wanted to have knife control. Because,
it was and that worked really well. Some guy in Scotland got arrested for carrying a potato peeler.
I'm not. It's too soon to even have this debate. It was a terrible, terrible situation in Saskatchewan. Yes. I'm not sure what the motivation was, but now that you've mentioned it, it's worth expressing our own condolences and
absolutely
and horror, if you will, at the magnitude of this crime. But let's use our English correctly, okay? I'm sick to death of hearing people talk about tragedies when people perpetrate this kind of act. This is a crime, right. Absolutely, full stop. Okay, let's call it what it is. It's a horrific crime. It's not a tragedy.
Okay, but according to what I've been able to learn, and John has just posted that both suspects are now dead. Right. So if there's, and I don't take satisfaction in the death of anyone, but at least this brings the saga to a close. So that I had to mention it when he posted that.
Sure, of course.
I'm trying to remember what I was talking about. What were we talking about before that came up?
Nick, we were talking about the government controlling the economy.
California.
That's it.
In 2024, 2026, they're going to start to ban the sale where 35% of all cars have to be electric. And by 2035, there will be no more retail outlets that sell ICEs or internal combustion engines. And so they're promoting this whole idea of owning electric cars. And yet within the last few days, they have had a climate, what do they call it? Climate flexible moment or something like that, where the governor of California told people, don't charge your electric cars, turn your thermostats up to 80. They are the most heavily dependent on wind and solar as any state in the union. As a matter of fact, they're often held up as the example. And now they're running around saying, you can't use electric cars right now because the grid won't handle it. Well, if it won't handle it now, what's going to happen starting in 2026?
Well, this has always been a problem on this stuff, Nick. How do you get the electricity to run everything that you want to run on electricity? And it's not impossible, but we don't have the generating capacity now to do that. We don't have, even if we had the generating capacity, we don't have the distribution network. Right. And above all else, this penchant for solar and wind heating, and again, I'm not heating, but solar and wind generating it's just not. It's like a fantasy. I was telling somebody the other day, some of the stuff that you read, it's like living in a Harry Potter novel, okay, where you get to wave some sort of a magic wand or the wizard appears or something like that, and poof, all of a sudden things are working. That's just not the way it is in the real world. So speaking for myself, I've never been against electric heat. I've never been against electric cars or electric buses or an electric, if you will, economy. But at some point in time, you have to figure out the generating problem, and wind and solar just don't cut it. And the number one reason why they don't cut it is because they don't generate consistently the kind of power that we need, or that we're certainly going to need, in order to power all of these wonderful electric appliances and cars and heat our homes and everything. So
that doesn't even talk about the human rights violations that goes into making.
And that's not right. Then that's not talking about that. Now, I hate to say this because this is going to make some people's heads explode out there. Maybe not our viewers or listeners, but other people. And that is that if this is the direction that you want to go, then the truth is ultimately we're probably talking about nuclear generated electricity. And a lot of our electricity is already generated by nuclear power, but there are a lot of people out there that really hate that idea. And I'm going, okay, well, what's the alternative to nuclear? Is coal or gas fired? Because wind and solar don't cut it.
Okay, now Chrissy just made a good point. She said it sounds like California is the guinea pig to see how the grids can handle these e-cars. Yeah, Chrissy, I would maybe that's true, but I think you also have a governor out there who is so totally blinded or so in bed with the wind and solar industry, like big wind and big solar. Whenever you want to make an industry sound bad, you put big in quotes around it. So big wind and big solar, that matter. He's not affected by this. I wouldn't be surprised to find out his house is powered by an internal combustion powered generator. So if the power dips or he has a blackout, it doesn't bother him. Welcome back, Craig. Anyway, the point that I'm making is that these people have no idea what the consequence will be. For example, there was a pundit today in the media who is an environmentalist who said, we can't handle this. We cannot. He's talking about California now. And he's saying that we cannot handle. There's 30 million cars in California alone. Okay. California and Canada are roughly about the same size economically and as population wise.
Right. That's correct.
About 30 million cars. If we tried to turn them over in the next 5 years, we would have to build 10 nuclear power stations just to meet what we have now. What are we going to do when it gets to that? And Canada's in the same situation. We've got Darlington, we've got Pickering, we've got a bunch of other different nuclear power plants scattered across the country. And they do provide that baseline power. But if Ottawa, as an example, buys all these electric buses, forces everybody into electric vehicles, where's all that power going to come from? It's the same story. You're exactly right. Unless we have the generating capacity, this is nothing more than a pipe dream. Right. And it drives me out of my mind. And again, we haven't even touched the environmental damage it causes when you dig up the rare earth metals to make this stuff out of lithium and cobalt and all that stuff, or the slave labor, mostly children, living in Africa, working for pennies a day, shipping it to China, and you know how well they treat their workers to make batteries to feed this market. I don't want anything to do with that stuff.
Well, those are all very good points, also, Nick, and I don't mean to ignore them.
I'm not
all I'm doing is I'm just focusing on the immediate first step practical issue, and that is this. Okay, let's say that I'm a supporter of electrification over fossil fuels. Okay, and I'm not opposed to doing that. Okay, all I'm saying is that if you want to do that, you have to do it. You have to take the necessary steps in order to make that transition successfully. Now, yes, I can raise all kinds of other objections, but just on that one narrow point, from a purely technical, purely engineering perspective, if you want to have an electric environment, an electric economy, if you want electricity to be your sole or chief energy source, then you have to deal with the generating and distribution problem. And for people, when I talk this way, and people go, well, you're just a climate change denier, and I'm going, this has nothing to do with climate change. This is let's just set aside climate change for a minute altogether, and let's just say that we decide that climate change isn't a problem. That's not the issue here. We can all agree that electricity doesn't generate any kind of pollution, okay, other than in the generating side of things. But you don't want to cause pollution when you drive your car, okay? Drive an electric car. It's not a bad. Electric cars and electric heat are not bad things. So let's not, just for the sake of right now this discussion, let's not argue about climate change. Let's not argue about any of that stuff. And let's just talk about the desire to have an electric economy or electric energy-based economy, okay? Fine. In order to do that, you have to deal with the generating problem and the distribution problem. And for the life of me, okay, for the love of Pete, I don't understand the mental block that proponents of electric heat and electric cars and all of this stuff have with that fundamental problem. And it's not an ideological problem. It's not a climate change versus climate denier problem, and none of that. It's a basic engineering problem, and there's solutions to it. But if you're going to do it, you have to do it in the right way, in the right order. And these guys are just not interested in having that discussion. And all that ends up happening is you end up with another California where you people are following, they're doing this because they're being encouraged to do it or forced. And all of a sudden they realize that they can't drive their cars anymore because the governor is saying, don't plug your car in because we don't have enough electricity.
Yeah. Look, this is more of the nonsense. And Craig made a great point. Most of the EV charging stations in California are powered by coal or natural gas. There's a great clip out of Warren, Michigan, where one of the senior vice presidents of, I think it was Chevrolet, was introducing a new car. And they said to her, where'd you get the power? Like, where's the power come from? Charge your car? Well, you plug it into the wall. Well, where does the building get it that you're plugging it into? And she had to be reminded that just down the road was a coal-fired power plant providing all the electricity to charge her electric car.
Right.
I think sometimes these people get so caught up in trying to put, because I'm not, let me state this for the record. I'm not against progress. I mean, I don't want to drive, as much as it would be cool to own a Model T Ford, I wouldn't want that as my main means of transportation. Okay. No air conditioning, no heating. I don't know if they had windshield wipers, and not the kind of vehicle I want to run around in.
Just manual ones.
Yeah, you had to reach out. I don't know, but the point is that there's times when technology passes by what's available, and that's a good thing. Let's take one of my favorite airplanes, a Spitfire, a beautiful plane. In the 40s, it was one of the most deadly planes in the world. Would I want to fly one into combat today? Not on your life. Not against anything that flies today, because technology's passed it by. So I'm not against advancing technology. Against is pushing technology for its own sake. There's a reason why we use fossil fuels, because it gives us the most energy in the smallest package. That's why. I watched a video about Tesla batteries and gasoline, and they were comparing how much gasoline, a gallon of gas, okay, a US gallon of gas, how much does the Tesla battery, what does it take? What kind of battery do you have to equal that 1 gallon? And with the great big battery that's in those cars, you got 1 gallon. That was worth 1 gallon of gasoline.
Well, I don't know. I take your word for that, Nick. I do know that we have not licked the power storage problem yet.
That's the other Achilles heel.
And right now what you're doing is you're describing the problem of storing energy, electrical energy, on a small scale in an individual car. Think of the magnitude of the problem in storing the electricity that's generated by wind or solar that is necessary. We must store that electricity to have it in reserve in order to power whatever we need to power when the wind isn't blowing, or in the wintertime here in Canada, when those solar panels are under, we have a snowstorm, and they're under 3 feet of snow, and it might take a week or even 2 weeks to clear the snow off and get them operating again. So this is what happens right now with those regions that are using wind power in particular, and that is that you have to, in those areas where you have to have continual energy, like we do in Canada in the wintertime, you have to have that energy. Okay. Those jurisdictions have to have a backup. And the backup is typically coal or gas-fired electrical generation. Now, here's the other engineering problem, not to bore our listeners with all of this stuff, okay? But, I know a thing or two about this stuff because I used to do it, okay? You cannot just walk into a massive gas-fired electrical generating plant and flick the switch and everything works, okay? It just doesn't work that way. It has to be running all the time, perhaps at a lower capacity, but it has to be running all the time in order to have that energy available in a short period of time, if not instantaneously, when it's needed. And so everybody that's talking about wind power or solar power, especially in a country like Canada, don't seem to understand that solar power and wind power must be supplemented by another generating capacity. So again, ultimately, what's the solution? If you're looking for a long-term solution that doesn't emit so-called greenhouse gases, the answer is nuclear. But nobody wants to talk about that. And what we're doing is we have set up all of these barriers to dealing with real problems. And if anyone comes up against the barrier, then a terrible political cost is exacted against them.
Now, Chrissy made a good point, and it's a technical one, but she was asking about de-icing systems for wind turbines in the wintertime. I have a little experience with de-icing, and you know what? It's a good point. So even if you have a day when there is wind, even though it was cloudy, but there's a little bit of humidity in the air, you can very easily ice up those blades and ruin their efficiency. That's why airplanes can't fly with ice in their wings. So, you make that's a great point.
Yeah, I don't know what all of the details are on the icing of those windmill blades. It's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, apparently, according to John, he just posted, wind turbines are also more prone to encounters of freezing rain and other low altitude, high water content environments, such as an ocean spray or offshore wind turbines. Most current wind turbines have anti-de-icing methods which remove ice buildup through the electric heating or blowing hot air inside. Okay, so where's the electricity come from? Where's the hot air come from? You have to heat an element. So you're making them even less efficient because you're consuming some of that power as sacrificial just to make the thing work. Yeah, so it's just another bad idea that we drove through. There's a section on the way down from Sudbury. Is it Sudbury? Along the Lake Superior shore, maybe closer to Thunder Bay. And the hills were just covered with these wind turbines. And I watched, I thought, what a waste. It just breaks your heart when you see this because it's not necessary. Look, you were right about nuclear power, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. We got to go for break. But there is another technology, and I keep bringing this up every time you bring up nuclear. It's called energy from waste. And we've been ready
Yes.
for that for years, and would solve a bunch of problems at once, and you wouldn't need a single turbine or solar panel.
Well, let's. I don't know how close we are to a break here, Nick, but let's talk about that when we get back.
All right, we'll do that because we're right up against the clock. We'll be back with more on the Nick and Joe show right after this.
Who says you can't turn the clock back? Experience the excitement of open-air flying and see Canada's national capital region like you've never seen it before from the open cockpit of a vintage 1930s biplane. Are you up for the adventure? Put on your helmet and goggles and strap yourself in. Book your flight today. Go to OttawaBiplaneAdventures.com. That's OttawaBiplaneAdventures.com. Ottawa Biplane Adventures. The adventure begins here.
Oh my gosh, that was so exciting! I gotta do it again.
All right, welcome back to Nick and Joe show, folks. We've been having a very interesting discussion about energy and politics and you name it. And Joseph mentioned as we went to the break that we should talk about energy from waste. And this is a topic I know a little bit about. I worked with a gentleman for about 5 or 6 years, maybe a little longer than that, trying to get the city of Ottawa to adopt his version of energy from waste. Now, the guy's first name was Jeff. He'd been an engineer for over 50 years, knew his stuff. And I won't make this very technical, but what his idea was, and it had been tried and tested, everything was there. It was ready to go. All you do is build the plant. But what his method was, you take municipal garbage, and it doesn't matter what it is. The only thing you would weed out is aluminum, copper, and steel because they're so expensive to make in the first place. Doesn't make any sense to run them through an incinerator. And I'm using the word incinerator when it should be energy from waste. So forgive me for that because I don't want to invoke images of the 1970s style, 60s style incinerators where they were dirty and they stunk and they smoked. This was not like that, not even close. As a matter of fact, the air coming out of these things was cleaner than what was going in. But what you would do is you take the municipal garbage, grind it up in a what do they call those machines now? Shredder.
Well, let's just say grinder.
Yeah, it was a shredder. So you could drop anything from a Volkswagen bus right down to a zipper into the thing, and it would just churn out pellets underneath. Then you would dry it with run it through a tumbling dryer into a cyclonic vortex combustion chamber, and you would burn it really, really hot, and you would let it dwell in there until combustion was complete. If you ever been around a fire, you see smoke coming off, let's say a campfire, there's smoke coming up. What that's telling you is that the combustion of the wood or whatever you're burning is not complete. That's what the smoke is. It's uncompleted combustion. This technology took it and made sure there was no smoke. It included silica to capture all the stuff that you can't burn, arsenic, lead, zinc, so on, that you don't want in the atmosphere or in the ground, encase it in glass, and then it would shear off the insides of the furnace as it got hot and the molten glass got heavy, it would shear off and drop to the bottom. And it was just like black marbles. It was completely inert and completely safe. And you could, with 75 tons a day, I believe, now it's been a long time since I looked at the numbers, but I think it was about 10 megawatts of power for 75 tons a day of garbage. And how many homes would that heat? And every town with, let's say, 100,000 people or more, or let's say take a county, Renfrew County, you just gather up all the trash, you take it to one spot, you grind it up, and you extract the energy it contains. You don't need to put up a nuclear power plant. You just consume and recycle, ultimate recycling by extracting the energy that the garbage contains and putting it back into the power grid as cheap and affordable electricity. And it's the single best way I've ever encountered to do it. So there's that. If you balance it between that and electrical power or nuclear power, there would be no reason for a single windmill or a single solar panel in this country. None.
Yeah, and look, this is an ongoing discussion here in Ottawa, and that is, what do we do with our waste? Because the dump that we have now is going to be full soon, and so there's all of this. This is all this talk about finding a new location for a new dump, etc. And I guess where I would come from with this, Nick, is I would start by pointing out that ever since the dawn of civilization, the way we've handled our garbage is by digging a hole, throwing the garbage in, and burying it.
Yep.
And so really the problem is that we're trying to apply let's be generous and call it a first century solution to what is essentially a 21st century problem, because we have a growing population, and you can pass bylaws and all of this stuff in order to limit the amount of trash that every individual or every individual family is tossing out on a weekly basis or bi-weekly here in Ottawa.
Right.
But there's only so little trash that there's only so much efficiency that you can squeeze out of the individual family. I mean, people are going to produce garbage, and the more people we have living in the city, the more garbage is going to be produced. So all I'm saying is maybe it's about time that we just apply a 21st century solution to the problem as opposed to a first century solution. And what does that mean? Let's find alternatives to landfill. Now, I'm not getting into a question of what the best alternative is. What I am saying is that there are alternatives out there that are efficient, they're clean, and above all else, they're already operating. They're tried and tested, and so what we have to do is we have to get over this mental block we have, this emotional aversion to doing this. And as you point out, Nick, we could generate really a lot of our own electricity without through such a process without having to build like here in Ottawa where they're talking about 710 wind turbines, in order to generate electricity. So why wouldn't we be having a serious conversation about this stuff? And I'm hoping that in Ottawa that we're going to be able to have that conversation.
I am too, and I'd be glad. Like I have a pretty good grasp of the technology. And just looking at what Craig mentioned in the comments, that's not the case in this particular technology. You don't have any gases that never produce electricity. You have a way of capturing the heavy metals that would normally be polluting. It really is a brilliant technology, and I don't have the time or the most people their eyes would glaze over if I tried to get into the technical side of it. But I could tell you without a shadow of a doubt, this system is genius, and it's really something we should have engaged years ago. But my overall, from time in terrestrial radio, even to now, when you mention energy from waste, people's eyes light up. They understand the population is so far ahead of the politics on this, or the politicians on this, that it's embarrassing. I think there's a lot of behind the counter deals that go on when it comes to municipal waste, and I'm not accusing anybody of anything because I don't have any facts in front of me. But my sense is municipalities across the country make deals that, they have a certain tipping fee and it's just out of their hair. They don't have to think about it anymore. And they don't worry about, are we advancing or are we still using 1,500, 2,000, 10,000-year-old technology?
Well, Nick, the beauty of what you're talking about is when you talk about tipping fees, the fact is that the garbage still has to be collected and it still has to be, deposited somewhere. So nobody except for maybe the guys driving the front end loaders at the landfill site, would be out of a job on something like this. And frankly, those guys would end up working at one of these stations, or maybe you have 2 or 3 or multiple stations. Okay, so the beauty of this is that you're able to adopt 21st century technology, find a 21st century solution to an ancient problem, and unlike where you adopt technology to whatever the situation is that you're confronting, typically technology eliminates human labor. The beauty of this is it doesn't eliminate any human labor, because, as I say, people still have to have their garbage collected. Okay, the garbage still has to be dumped wherever you're dumping it. Maybe it's not a landfill site, maybe it's a waste energy center, and from there it's got to be sorted and organized and moved around, and that's what your front end loader, your heavy equipment drivers are doing at the landfill site. So it's win-win-win.
It is, absolutely. And I've been saying this for over a decade, but John makes a good point. He's asking about, is it not also possible to mine the landfill that let's say, take Trail Road as an example in Ottawa, or Moose Creek out here in Renfrew County. You pick any landfill you want, who cares? You can extract a certain amount of that. It's roughly about 10%, because what happens is over time, what you're putting through the energy from waste extraction machine or facility has lost some of its calorific value. Okay, in other words, the wood started to rot and it's not as combustible, things like that. Now, plastic doesn't matter. You can bury plastic and dig it up again and it's fine. Okay, that's the thing about plastic. It's as much as ugly as it looks to see plastic bags. It doesn't really hurt the environment. It just looks crappy. Rubber tires, same thing. You could burn those. Okay, and you can mine that. And let's say you did 10% of the mine capacity on any, or 10% of your 75 tons. I'm using 75 tons just as a generic number. You can make these as big or as small as you want. 75 tons, but the limit on the small side. But you could have a row of them, 75 times how many you want. You could have 250, 400 tons, depending on the city. But whatever that is, you take 10% of that, and you can certainly run that through the incinerator, and that would take care of, you would eventually turn your landfill into a lake. Wouldn't that be nice? So that's a little bit on where I'd like to see. This is an advancing in technology that I don't have any problem promoting. There's no downside here. As you point out, it's a win-win-win. So why we can't get politicians, and I tried for 10 years to get politicians to listen to what Jeff had to say. And they had these contracts and they were signed and they didn't want to break them and they didn't want to look at any new, or in Ottawa's case, there was already a system in place which didn't work and was never going to work, called plasma gasification. It's a good technology applied in a really bad way. And just, we couldn't get over that hump. So there we are. So now we got to start all over again. Hopefully this council will be far more interested in listening this time. I should have one set of friendly ears, shouldn't I?
Well, yeah, I suppose in the interest of full disclosure, we should point out to our listeners and our viewers that I actually am running for council. So
you know what? I took it for granted they knew that already. I'm sorry.
Well, let's play it safe so that nobody accuses us of doing anything, behind their backs or nefariously or anything like that, Nick.
Right. Good point.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so that's a little bit on that. Now, there is another issue I want to bring up. And you know that during COVID, and there was this huge run on mortgages, people buying homes to get out of the city so they're not trapped by another lockdown, all that thing. We saw it, this massive increase in prices for homes, land, you name it. Well, the chickens are coming home to roost. And that looks a lot like this. The Bank of Canada hikes its benchmark interest rate again to 3.25%. Now, I remember when they were talking about going negative on the interest rate. You remember that? Well, they're not talking.
I remember that.
Yep. Well, they're done talking that way. Now they're worried that they're going to have to keep increasing it. Why? to get a handle on inflation, make
Right.
money more expensive, people won't borrow as much, and therefore the debt won't be as high, and things will start to come down in price. That's the logic. So the question, I guess I could read some of this article, but the bottom line is that's really what matters. The interest rates are beginning to creep up again, and they're saying that we're not done by a long shot. Who knows where this could end up? Now you have something called, what do they call it? There's a TRIP. Do the Bank of Canada rate impacts the rates Canadian customers business get? Okay, once you reach a certain point where inflation drives the amount that you put against your capital that you borrowed down and your interest up, sooner or later you cross a threshold where even if all of it's going to interest, you've reached the point where none of it's going towards the capital, and that forces them to raise that interest rate again on your mortgage. And that's going to drive up the price that you make your payments every month. So if let's pick a number, let's say it's $1,500 a month for your mortgage, all of a sudden now it's $1,700 or $1,800. That eats out of your budget. And if it keeps creeping up like that, people are going to, there's a lot of mortgage, a lot bigger than that out there. This is the downside of what we saw. And I'm just really worried you're going to see a massive collapse in the mortgage side of things, where people are not going to be able to afford these homes that they went out and spent, way more than they were ever worth on.
Well, let me respond by starting with that, Nick, and pointing out to you that when people ask me what the proper price is for any product, I always tell them the proper price is exactly what people are willing to pay for it. Right. So I wouldn't say that homes are worth this or not worth or whatever it is. They're worth exactly what you paid for. Okay, you determined what the worth of that home is. In terms of the bank, however, the value of the home could go up or it could go down. Now, the situation right now, as you I think very rightly point out, is that as interest rates go up, so that'll have two effects. If you're in a mortgage and you're very heavily mortgaged, then you're going to find that you're going to find people out there who, when they go to renew their mortgage at a higher interest rate, aren't going to be able to afford to make the payments.
That's right.
A, and B, the other concern about that in the situation is that if the value of their home is dropped, then they may actually find themselves actually are owing more money to the bank than their home actually is worth. And the question in that case is, will you even be able to get a mortgage for the value of your home? Because, or are you going to be forced into a situation where you have to pay off a mortgage or you have to pay the money that you've borrowed without having any kind of security against it? Yeah. And what will the impact of that be in terms of lending and mortgages and stuff like that? I don't know, but it can't be good.
Element. There is a third element.
Go ahead.
And that is, if you're 25 or 30 and been saving, all of a sudden now with an increased interest rates, your mortgage payments if you could have gotten a mortgage earlier, now you can't because the payments would be too high because of the higher interest rate. So there's a triple-edged sword here. You've got one side, the two sides you've articulated, and the fact you're going to keep more people out of the housing market simply because they cannot manage the payments.
Right. And so,
or come up with a payment.
Yeah. So I mean, what the bottom line here is that the value of homes is going to drop. And so homes are actually, because of of raising interest rates in response to inflation, home values are probably going to drop, and that's going to have an impact on equity. And if you're borrowing money elsewhere against the equity in your home, if you have an equity line of credit or whatever, that's going to impact it as well. How serious the impact is going to be, I mean, who knows? I'm not making any predictions, except I will say this: if you're smart and you can, I would say deleverage as much as possible, and that is to say, get rid of whatever credit card debt you have. In fact, nobody should ever carry credit card debt, to be honest. And some people, they have no choice. I understand that, but if you don't have a choice, or if you do have a choice, don't accumulate credit card debt. Use your credit card to pay it off every month. And if you can't afford to pay it off every month, then you're spending too much money. You have to treat your credit card like cash. So that's number one. But on any other opportunity you have to pay off debt, do it and don't take on more debt. I think that's a prudent thing to do. But, Nick, I have to circle back on what you pointed out in terms of the negative. At one point in time, talk about a negative interest rate. Okay. Well, let's just forget about that, because that's just too weird for people to wrap their minds around, even me, to be honest with you. And let's just talk about 0% or very low interest rates in order to generate economic activity. Well, understand that the whole idea of generating economic activity by having low interest rates out there is to encourage people to borrow. And I've always thought to myself, that's an awful thing to do. So I don't believe that the right thing for us to have done has ever been to lower interest rates to the point where they were, 0 or 0.1% or 0.25%. Okay, low interest rates. 3.25% that everybody's up in arms against is actually not a high interest rate. Sorry, I remember my parents when they bought their house, and I used to talk to them about it later on. When they had their mortgage, they had signed at 6%, and that was like in the mid 1960s. And then and that was at the time when we'd had these discussions. That was in the time when I was, in the market for a new car, etc. And we were paying at that time, 20, 21, 22% interest on car loans, for pity's sake. And my parents used to say, 6% interest, it'll never be that low again. So,
and look, I get what you're saying, but there's a difference, though. What was the tax burden on the average family in the 60s when you're talking about?
Well, you have to be careful where you're going with this. I know where you're going, Nick. Okay, and I don't have the data in front of me immediately, but I think that you have to remember that in the 60s and into the 70s, and really up until Reagan in the United States and Thatcher in the United Kingdom came along. People who were making good money were paying outrageous taxes. So the tax rates, the upper tax rate in the United States anyway was if it wasn't 90%, it was pretty close to 90%. And so I mean,
true.
It was crazy. So
okay, but my point though is most people we're not in the 90 percentile income tax bracket. I don't think anybody should pay that kind of money.
Right.
But when you're talking about your, let's quote unquote, average income, the tax rate wasn't nearly what it is. Like the middle class in today's economy doesn't pay a lion's share of the taxes, but on an individual basis, those bills still hurt. Like when you have to cut a check to the government just to keep the government going, right out of your own pocket, that hurts. So there was more, can I say wiggle room, or there was more cushion back then than there is now, because you could get by on one income in those days. Today it's almost impossible.
Sure. So, and things were cheaper. We didn't have to pay as much in terms of fees for different things, etc.
That's right.
And there were so many things that people buy today and take on tremendous debt for, younger people particularly, simply weren't available. We didn't have computers. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have any of that stuff. So, we had, I remember the days, Nick, when, when you wanted to order a new phone for your house, you had to place the order with Bell Telephone. And it might take a week or 2 weeks for them to make their way out to where you were out in the boondocks, okay, and to install the phone. And nowadays,
long distance rates are through the roof. Yeah, I get it.
And long distance and party lines too. I mean, we didn't even have our own line, for Pete's sake, at first.
Yeah, look, there's been quantum leaps ahead in certain areas, but generally speaking, it now takes two incomes to provide what one used to. And yes, it's true. We have cell phones, we have computers, we can do home
and
studios that were not
and big
possible
and big
30
houses
years.
too. I have to say this,
Yeah.
Nick. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I really have to point
Go
out
ahead, finish your thought.
houses that with all due respect to my friends and everybody out there, hey, look, buy the biggest house you want. It's free country, no problem. Okay, but understand that back in our day, our parents started out more modestly, and my parents would never have thought, even if they could afford a house with 5 bedrooms and 2 or 3 bathrooms or whatever, they would never have done it. Our house was a 3 bedroom house, and we had 6 people living there with 1 bathroom, not 1.5, but 1 bathroom, uh, and uh, and uh, and we there was a garage, but we got rid of the garage to convert it into a small family room, and a fourth bedroom, because my parents felt that they had to have a fourth bedroom. So so the point is that people are moving into expensive housing, that they really don't need, and it's and again, I'm not criticizing them for it. As if you can do it, do it. Okay, if that's your choice, but understand that at some point in time, you have to go back to the old-fashioned putting money in the bank and saving it up, and you're never going to do
Yeah,
that
it's
if you
called
keep on
delayed
spending it.
gratification. Yeah, it's called delayed gratification. And you're quite right. My
Right.
dad bought a whole farm, 72 acres in 1972, and I believe the whole purchase price was somewhere between 60 and $70,000. Now, it's just look, but everything's relative. Inflation, as we talked about, hadn't eaten into the family budget the way it has now. There are things available now that weren't available then. That's all true. But the bottom line is the thing that is propelling inflation and the degradation of the Canadian standard of living is still taxes. Craig pointed out here shortly in the comments, the average Canadian family or household paid nearly $40,000 in taxes last year. So, in other words, to make 40,000, you had to earn 80,000 if you want to come home with
Right.
40. That's about
Right.
50% of your income. Maybe I'm a
Yeah.
little bit high, but let's say
No,
70,000
no, you're not. You're accurate, Dick. The average, if you want to take averages, and let's be careful
with
reading
average.
too much
Yeah.
into averages, but if you're going to take averages, the reality is that the average Canadian family pays more than 50%, or around 50% of its income goes to taxes. Now, that may not be income taxes. It may
Well,
not
it's
even
tax
be
on charge.
obvious taxes. It may be hidden
Right.
taxes.
Right.
But somewhere in that order, that's what it is. And that it's almost, we almost have recreated feudalism.
You know what? I hate to say it. And you know what else I hate to say? We're now up against the clock and we are
Yeah.
quickly running out of time. So, in other words, getting back to the interest rates and what's going on in Vancouver, or Squamish, I should say, out in BC, these guys don't have any answers. They'd have given them to us if they had them, or if they thought that, you know, if they actually stuck their head out of their ivory towers and see how the rest of us live, or even spend a week. Like I would love to change places with Trudeau for a week and let him live on my budget compared to me living on his. He'd get a culture shock like he'd never experienced before. And I'm sure that's true of millions of Canadians across the country. He has no idea what it costs. Like, ask him, what's a cup of coffee cost in a diner? What's a breakfast cost? What does a loaf of bread cost? What about a quart of milk? Do you know how much it costs to fill a pickup truck with gas? He has no answers because he doesn't understand these things. His lifestyle is taken care of not only by you and I, but from the trust fund he lives off. So, anyway, I think we'll wrap it up there tonight. Thank you, Joseph, for making yourself available. I know you got a busy schedule with, your run for municipal office, and I wish you all the best on that. I really think you'll be a great addition around the table down there, and give whoever ends up as mayor, a nice check and balance to some of the nonsense.
Well, we'll see. It's still a steep hill to climb, so a lot to do between now and election day.
All right, I want to say the same thing to Craig. Go get him, buddy. He's running for municipal
and
office.
guess
I think it's down in
Calabogie, and Nick, our friend Chris Fraser's running for office too.
Chris Fraser too. That's right. You guys better not both get elected. What am I going to do for co-host?
Well, I don't know, but we'll do. Chris and I'll do a show from City Hall. John, you could produce it.
That, you know what? That would be fun. I would love to do that. Anyway, all right. So with that, I'm going to sign off for both Joe and I. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. In the meantime, we'll see you all again next week. Ubiqueritas et amor, Dea CBS. Good evening. God bless. Wouldn't be my first time. And may you have a fair wind in the following sea.